I'm not a public speaker and I'm not a historian, so it's possible that I will get a fact wrong, and I'm very receptive to being corrected afterwards. It's also very important for me to speak here today because usually Holocaust survivors and children of survivors speak at synagogues, at the JCC, in predominantly Jewish crowds. But I really feel strongly that it's important for me to tell this story to a Christian crowd. And so that's why I reached out to some churches, and I'm very happy to be here. My story, this is my mother's story, not my story. My mother's story, my parents are both Holocaust survivors from Eastern Poland, which is now Western Ukraine, in an area called Galicia. The story begins in 1925, before my mother was born, in a town of Drohobych, which I would say is comparable to West Hartford. There's about 50,000 people. The demographics are about 1/3 Jewish, 1/3 Polish Catholic, and 1/3 Ukrainian. And the children, many of the children will go to school together, and the adults will do business together, but they don't mix that much socially. I mean, a little bit, and you have neighbors that are different religions, but socially, mostly people keep to themselves. Except my grandfather, who was a businessman, who also liked to go fishing and liked to play poker, so he found himself in a more mixed crowd, which ended up being a very good thing, actually. And also the town is about an hour and a half away from a big city called Lvov, which is still a big city today, but it had an hour and a half by car or train. Not many people have a car, not many people travel often, so the town had its own commerce, and my grandfather had a business in the center of town. He was a fur trader. So it's 1925, and it's a warm day, and Sarah Beanstalk is pushing her baby, Ludwig is his real name, in a stroller to a park. And as she gets close to the park, a young girl approaches her and says, "Can I play with the baby at the park?" Which is, I think if you're a mom, you know this probably happened. You went to a park one day and an older child wanted to play with the baby. So Sarah said sure, and she sits on a bench, and she's watching this girl interact, and it's just a very lovely interaction. And she asks this girl, who's actually barefoot and looks kind of poor, "Where are you from?" And she names a nearby town, like a village that's a kind of a poor village. And she says, "What's your name?" And the girl says, "Frania." "How old are you?" 15. "What are you doing here today? Where's your family? What are you doing?" "I came here to find a job. I have 5 younger brothers and sisters, and my father is dead, and we all have to work to help feed the children." So my grandmother says, "You know what? If you have a job with me, you come to my house. I'll pay you. I'll give you a room, and I'll feed you, and your job will be to look after the baby." So the deal is made. Actually, Frania has all of her belongings on her back in a bag. She really was looking for a job. So she came to the house and started to take care of Lushik. And fast forward 3 years, child number 2 is born. The family is a little bit more prosperous, and they've moved to a larger apartment, and Frania is now 18 and really raising these children. And then 3 more years later, my mother is born, Irene, and now the family will eventually, Israel, that's my grandfather, will build a very big house, which when we traveled I've been to that town twice, once with my mother and then once, not with my mother, but my husband was with me, and we saw the house, and when I say it's a big house, I'm not kidding. It's multiple apartments now, and now there's a doctor's office attached to it. So that's a house that Israel built, and the family moves there, and suffice it to say, they're very successful. And my grandfather has some, he has a nice reputation in town, and everything is good until 1939. And in September of 1939, the Germans invade Poland, and Israel goes off to war to fight for the Polish army, and the battle is pretty fast. And here my historians will know exactly how fast, but it's pretty fast. Pretty much by the time he comes home, when the battle's over, Germany has taken Poland, and Lushik has died, because during that period of war, he got pneumonia and there was no medication, so he died in his room. And my mother showed us the room where he died in, and she was in the room, and he said something, and then he just died. So that's sort of the turning point, and everything kind of got bad from there. You know, as my mother would say, her parents never recovered, and you know, she said her mother, the death of her son impacted her more than the entire Holocaust, which was to follow. So what happens in 1939 is the Germans make a deal with Russia. Part of Poland will be German, and part of it will become Russian, and this part will become part of Russia. So what that means for this family is they're persecuted not so much for being Jewish, more so because Israel is a successful businessman, and that makes him an enemy of the Soviets. So pretty quickly, they have to leave their house, and they go and they move in with into a nearby town, and they stay with relatives, and they'll stay there the entire approximately year and a half that this is part of Russia. The girls will go to Russian school. Israel gets on his papers, it's designated undesirable, which means, and he loses his business, and he's marked undesirable, which means nobody will do any business with him. In school, a lot of the kids get involved in Soviet youth groups, kind of like, you know, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, but it's a little more political. But these children are not allowed because of who their father is. So things are not great. He does some business on the black market, and you know, and they're living with relatives. But then the Germans come back in I think June of 1941, and ironically, Israel is really happy about this, because he says, you know, to his family, you know, that he knows the Germans are civilized. You know, there's no internet, so not everybody knows what's happening. The Germans are civilized. He speaks German. He's done business with German. He's had enough of the Russians. This is going to be good. And of course, we all know how terribly wrong he is. So they go back to the house. And what happens when the Germans reoccupy that area is, first, they announce to all the local people, there's like a day or two of extreme violence. Do whatever you want to the Jews. Now, so people, it's a free-for-all. The police, there's no police protecting anybody. People are violent. I don't know if any of you have seen images of this kind of stuff. Random people, your neighbors, your friends, are now committing acts of violence against their former friends and neighbors. Violence, also they can take anything. You can now go into a house, you can have anything you want from a Jew. So when that sort of quiets down, there's a series of laws that will come, not all at once, but kind of in drips and drabs. So, and these are the kinds of rules. So first of all, the Jews have a curfew. And again, these are not in order. These are just examples. They have a curfew. They can't ride a bus. They can't own a car. They can't have a bicycle. The children can't go to school, which was the most devastating thing for my mother. They can't go to school. They can't own anything valuable. They have to give up their furs and their and jewelry and money. They cannot employ any non-Jews, which means now Frania can no longer work for the family, and that's also very devastating. So Frania will go and get another job, and she'll continue to visit the family, but she has a long job all day, so she doesn't have that flexibility. At this point, my mom is. This is 1941, so my mom is 10 years old, and Paula is like 14, 13, 14. Eventually, they will, and these few days of violence will happen periodically. They're called actions with a K, and they're just, it's a free-for-all. And during these periods, also, the Germans will be rounding up Jews, typically older people and young children. And so my grandmother, who's only in her 40s, but because she didn't really get over her son's death, my mother said she went gray overnight, and she looks already like an old lady. And my mother is very little. She's a 10-year-old, and her sister is very tall. So, the father and the sister are relatively safe. They can go to work. They can go work. It's kind of slave labor, but they can work. But Sarah, the mother, and Irene, my mother, they're in extreme danger. So these actions happen maybe once a month, I don't really know. And they're rounding people up, and that means sometimes they kill them on the spot. Sometimes they take them to the town square and they kill them. Sometimes they just take them in wagons to a forest, and they just shoot them in the forest. And at one point, the people know, and the Jews kind of know and they don't know, but at one point, they're also still in their house, but at this point, but several other families have moved in. And at one point, a cousin disappeared, a 10-year-old cousin, and she had been knitting some mittens. And a few days later, the mittens emerged in town, very distinct striped mittens, and the girl did not. So everybody knew. That's how you found out that somebody was dead, was you'd see something maybe of theirs, or you just didn't see them anymore. This goes on for several months, and eventually they just round up all the Jews and put them in a ghetto. And I used to think a ghetto was some unique place. It really wasn't. A ghetto is just a section of town where there's too many people in that town, and it's guarded. You can't easily get in and out. So, it would be, let's say, an area of town that was built to house 1,000 people, now has 8,000 people. And people, my mother and her sister and their parents are now living with like 3 or 4 other families in what we would call a one-family apartment. And so even there, periodically, like maybe once a month or so, there are selections. The Germans will come to the ghetto and they'll demand, we need X number of Jews. The goal here is eventually to get rid of all the Jews. But they haven't established the whole, they haven't got it all figured out how to do it en masse, so they're doing it in small numbers. At one point, and this is where my grandfather's poker and fishing friends came in handy, at one point they get word that there's an action coming, and at this point, Irene, my mother, and her mother are really in danger. So Israel goes to speak to Joseph Kostemsky, who's one of his fishing friends, who had been a judge before the war. He's a Ukrainian, and who the Nazis have installed him as the mayor of the town. He wasn't elected; he was just put there like a puppet government. And he goes to beg, "You have to save my family." And the mayor says, "No, I can't do it." And so Israel, like my mother said, he got on his knees and he begged. And Mr. Kostemsky's wife said, "You have to save this family." So he said, "Fine, go to the city hall at night, go to the clock tower, somebody's going to leave a door open and you go in there." And so the family of 4 people went at night, they snuck out of the ghetto, they got there and they went up to the clock tower, and we got to see that clock tower, and they waited in the clock tower for 4 or 5 days during an action, there's a lot of violence, and it's right in Town Square, just like in West Hartford Center. And my mother peeks out in the window, she and Paula are watching, and they can see all this violence happening right there in the center of town. This is just a comment for people that say, we didn't know. How could we know what was going on? I'm telling you, everybody knew. If you didn't know because these people were disappearing, and also I forgot something. Before they were moved to the ghetto, it was also a free-for-all, so people would come to your house and they would say, "I'd like that, give me that." And my mother remembered that 2 girls she'd gone to school with one day appeared and demanded some houseplants and said, we want the houseplants, you're not gonna make it anyway. And when I think about that, it gives me chills when we think about children who would go, these are your former friends and neighbors, would do that for some houseplants. It's pretty awful. Anyway, they are in the clock tower for 4 or 5 days, and there's only people that know are this mayor's family and one employee who's bringing them pastries from the bakery there. And after things quiet down, they emerge quietly, and at night they go back to the ghetto. But now they know that their time is running out, and there's plans to, between the fears of these selections within the ghettos, because the people running the ghettos have to give up people, or whatever, these 2 people in the family that cannot work, they know that their days are numbered now. So on Christmas Eve, this is Christmas Eve of, just a moment, I gotta get it right. Christmas Eve of 1942. They have contacted Frania, who they've been in touch with, but she works 12 hours a day, so there's a limited, and she can't easily come in and out of the ghetto. So they reach out to her, and she comes, and they give her Irene, my mother, who is in terrible shape. And so Frania comes on Christmas Eve, And she figures Christmas Eve is a good time to come because it's easy to get in and out because the guards will be drinking, they'll be celebrating, and there'll be people in the street celebrating. It'll be easy to sneak somebody out. And she wraps my mother up in every shred of clothing my mother has to bulk her up because at this point, there's very little food in the ghetto. So this is a skinny little kid with very dark hair, which she's clearly Jewish. Anyway, so she bundles her up and covers her hair with a scarf and takes her hand, and they walk. As soon as they walk out, they join a group of carolers, and they are singing songs. I also forgot in my haste to mention that Frania is a very devout Catholic woman. And so, I'm not a public speaker, but I should go back a little and say, she really raised the kids on a lot of values, although the family was Jewish, when the kids were growing up, she really taught them a lot about right and wrong based on her belief. Anyway, back to this, she takes my mother out and they're walking in the streets with the carolers, and my mother, who doesn't know any Christmas songs, is kind of, pretending to be singing, and she goes with Frania to her apartment, and we didn't get to the apartment. We stood outside the apartment, but I know from diagrams that my mother's sister made that it's a very small one-room apartment. And we saw the building, and it's a very small building where the apartments are, one door is maybe 20 feet away from the next door. I think I'm being generous there. And it's on the second or third floor. So here's the deal. My mother has to not move all day because Frania is working 12-hour shift, and there's people below and on all sides, and if they will hear even any footsteps at all, they will know that somebody's in that apartment. The penalty, which was posted everywhere, the penalty for hiding a Jew is immediate death. They will take you and the Jews you hid, and in the center of town they'll hang you, and they'll leave you hanging there so everybody else will see what happens when you hide a Jew. So my mother is 11. She is hiding all day under a bed. She can't move. She can't talk. There's no reading material because Frania is completely illiterate. She never went to school. So there's not a book, a magazine. There's nothing to do all day. My mother, if you can imagine, my mother is just under a bed all day for 12 hours. And then Frania comes home. And about 15 years ago, Nickelodeon did a show, and they said they were looking for grandparents and survivors and their grandchildren to do an interview for a show that aired on Nickelodeon. So my son, who at the time was 11, he was one of those kids. I'll tell you my mother's name. You could find the snippet of it on my mom's website. And then they asked my son, how would you feel if you were hiding under a bed all day long and you couldn't move, nothing to read, and my son, which is typical 11-year-old response, my son said, I would be bored. And because our kids can't imagine, not being stimulated. And my mother said, I can still hear her say this, I felt a lot of things. I was scared, I was hungry, I was sad. One thing I never was bored. And it was just a funny thing to think about. After all, she was an 11-year-old kid. She was not, that's who she was. So they found herself in that situation. After about 4, and the other thing is there wasn't enough food because Frania, people don't have a refrigerator. So Frania would bring food every day. You can imagine, she couldn't bring more food because if people were watching, so if she brought extra food, people would know something's up. So she shared whatever she had with my mother. And diagonally across the courtyard was a Gestapo headquarters, which we also, when we went with my mother said, yes, that's what was there. So it was really scary to think about what's happening in there, and there's neighbors. My mother was just not thriving at all. She was just, depressed all the time. So eventually, and I don't know how, this is like a piece of the story I'll never know, Frania went back to the ghetto and somehow got Sarah, that's my mother's mother, and my mother's sister Paula out of the ghetto. This is at a point where they're just, kind of swiftly liquidating the ghetto. They're now taking people to camps. And so it's really the ghetto days. I think, a few months, within 6 months of my mom escaping the ghetto is now closed. So now there's 3 people in that room. So the 2 girls are under the bed all day, no noise, and Sarah is in a closet. And this is the rest of the war. My mother was hidden for 2.5 years because they're liberated in May of 45. I may have done the math wrong, but they were there. My mother's there a total of 2.5 years. Again, now it's Frania, sharing one person's food among 4 people, which is, I don't know how that happened. Israel couldn't be hidden. First of all, he was a man, he's big, and he had been a smoker before the war, so he has a cough. So Israel escapes from the ghetto, and he will end up hiding in the forest, then a farmer hides him, and then he ends up in multiple concentration camps, and somehow by miracle he survives. I don't know how. After the war, in May of 45, the town is liberated. Some other things I forgot to mention. There were a lot of close calls when they were hiding. It wasn't, easy all the time, but Frania, even though she was illiterate, was really, really smart. So, not book smarts, but street smarts. So here's 2 stories my mother liked to share, which I really enjoyed. This shows you how smart she was. One time, somebody in her building was suspecting something. So Frania opens all the windows and the door to the apartment. The whole, in the hallway there where the other apartments are, it's maybe like 4 apartments. It's a very small little landing there. She opens all the windows and the door. And she kind of announces it's time for spring cleaning. And there's 3 people hiding in her tiny 1-room apartment, but she just knows, and it's open all day long. And she's cleaning and, making a lot of commotion about her cleaning, with the idea that if you know that she's doing this, she couldn't possibly be hiding anybody there in that little space. Another time, the Germans were thinking about taking that building for their own use because it was, so close to where their headquarters were. So the officers showed up, and Frania just took a bucket of water and threw it against the wall. And the guy says, "What's going on?" Right before she could see he was coming, she threw a bucket of water against the wall, and he said, "What's going on here?" And she said, "I don't know. Every time it rains, the water leaks in here." And I mean, it's funny now, but who would think of that? And so he had no interest in the building. But she didn't get that off the internet or a book. She just knew that's something to do. And I'm sure there's more stories like that, but those are the 2 that really stick with me. So anyway, they were liberated in May of 45 by the Russians. Unfortunately, that Mayor Kostemsky he had a wife and a teenage daughter. The Russians did not know the story about how he hid some Jews, so they killed him, they shot him on the spot. Him and his wife and his daughter, because he had been the mayor of the town, installed by the Nazis, so the Russians viewed him as a collaborator. And so, very sadly, he was not recognized. When we went with my mother in about 7, 8, maybe even 10 years ago, we went with my mother and my husband, my brother, Paula's son Jack, and a few other relatives, and also the Frania's niece. We went to that town and we went to the city hall and we wanted to tell the mayor about this Mayor Kostemsky and what he had done, because the story was untold. Nobody knew it. Only this one family knew it. And my mother said, "I really want to have a plaque installed. I want him to be acknowledged." And the person we talked to in City Hall was, we all signed something and we wrote something out, and then we never heard. It was kind of sad. But in January of 2019, all of a sudden I got a letter from the town tourism board. They're ready to acknowledge Mayor Kostemsky. They're going to install a plaque. So in the summer before COVID, so I guess summer of 2019, my mother couldn't travel anymore, but I went with my husband and my brother and we went to the town, and there is now at the City Hall a plaque, and there were people, I don't know, maybe 40, 50 people. It's on YouTube somewhere, but it's all in Ukrainian, except for when my brother and I are talking, but the rest of it's Ukrainian, and it's explaining, and it's nice that at the City Hall that they mark this location where he hid this family. So that's just to put a little footnote about Joseph Kostemsky. Anyway, and my point is, there were probably some other people who did good things. Not many, but there were some people that did good things. Anyway, the town is liberated. The Jews cannot go back to their houses. In many situations, there's people living in their houses, and those people are not going to give up those houses. These are your friends and neighbors who are now enjoying all your stuff, and they're not giving it back. And in many situations, people that tried to go back or killed by their former friends and neighbors for just, showing up. These people were not supposed to be alive. I think, and I went on the internet, I mean, there was maybe 15,000 before the war. I think only 300 people from that town survived. So you can imagine whoever's in the town emerging like rodents almost from their hiding places, and nobody wanted any part of them. That part of that did not become Poland again. It became, I don't know if it became, I mean, things bounced back and forth. I don't know if it was Ukraine under Russia or something, yeah. And so the Jews headed to the nearest place, the nearest part that was Poland. And so my mother and her sister and their mother and Frania left and went to Legnica, another part of Poland, where my mother and Pola completed high school under very terrible circumstances, being among the few Jews that were alive. And again, the kids that they were now with in this town, these were people that were very happy, largely, that the Jews were being killed. So they were not happy to be in school. My mother also had some terrible stories about how she was treated afterwards. And somehow Israel made his way back to them, asking here and there. He found his family, and they're reunited, and he started to be able to make a living. And he got an apartment, and he also got a separate apartment for Frania. And so eventually the family goes to Israel. When the doors are opened up, it's the new country of Israel. They go, and they beg Frania to go with them, and she says she can't go. She can't learn another language, and she needs to be here where her church is. So it was, the church was, as much as she loved the family, the church was also very important. And so she stayed there, and for the rest of, for all my childhood, my mother went to Israel, then she came to America, she met my father, another story. But my whole childhood, my mother was always sending packages to Frania. And as a kid, I didn't care. I mean, I'm happy to talk today, but as a kid, I didn't care about this stuff. I was having my own life, my own, 1960s and 70s life. I didn't care about the Holocaust. I didn't care about any of my parents' stuff. But I knew that twice a year packages went, and they were like, my mother would go to a very fancy grocery store and buy cookies and coffee, and she would take all the clothing my brother and I had outgrown, and she'd box it all up. And I understand this happened in a lot of families, and she would send it to Frania in Poland. And as a kid, I remember thinking, who's gonna wear this stuff? Who's gonna fit into my clothing? How do they know? And why are they sending cookies and coffee? Like, don't they have cookies and coffee in Poland? What a crazy thing. Later on, I found out it was all for the black market. This was like, these were commodities. People were, living, they were selling the clothing. They were not wearing, they were selling it, they were selling the coffee. When we traveled back with my mother and we met Frania's niece, we understood that from the stuff that we were sending, one summer they replaced a roof, or Frania never worked again the rest of her life, and they were largely living off of this stuff we were sending, and Polo was also sending packages. In 1976 or 77, Frania actually came to visit. The two sisters brought her over, and she stayed with us for 6 weeks. I wish I could tell you that I had a meaningful conversation with her, but we didn't speak the same language. And again, I was a young teenager. I didn't really care that much. I mostly remember that she did a lot of cooking. But it was, I can't make myself better than I was, but she stayed with us for 6 weeks, and then the whole entire freezer was filled with pierogi. And then she went to Atlanta for 6 weeks. And the sisters really, they tried to get her to stay, and she said no. She couldn't live. She did like going to the church, the cathedrals in New York City, but she couldn't make a new life. And she went back to Poland and actually passed away a year later. She got cancer. So that's mostly the end of the story. I don't know how long I talked for, but the reason when I think about this, I think now I know what I want to talk about. After Frania died, Pola and Irene applied. So I don't know if people know about what this is to be a designation of a righteous Gentile. So I'm looking at everybody's faces. I'm guessing no. So Yad Vashem is a very large and significant museum, Holocaust museum in Jerusalem. I think it's probably one of the first ones, if not the first one. And they created an honor called Righteous Gentile, and they have a physical space there where they have plaques with names, they have gardens. It is a person that, and I looked up the specific criteria to be designated. You had to save Jews. You had to be not Jewish. Like if you were Jewish and you saved Jews, it doesn't count because they assume that that's your obligation. Like that's not something special, although not everybody did. But anyway, needless to say, you had to save Jews for absolutely no compensation or expectation. So for example, if you were paid, you wouldn't qualify. If you were promised payment in the future, you wouldn't qualify. If you took children with the expectation that you could, convert them, there's a whole list of things. You had to do it for purely altruistic reasons and no possible gain. Also, you could also not have done something bad. So like Joseph Kostemsky probably wouldn't qualify, even though he did save 4 Jews. He also was the mayor, and for sure, there's other things probably that he did that weren't so great, so that would immediately, disqualify you. Anyway, the 2 sisters applied, and Frania got this, and it's a big deal. There's, if you think about it this way, 6 million Jews were killed, and I looked it up, and there are about 27,500 righteous Gentiles. So when you think about those numbers, you realize that there could have been a lot more people helping. It would have been good if more people had stepped up. Maybe the bigger number would have been smaller. But anyway, this is what it is. It's I would say for Jews, this is the equivalent of a saint. There's not a higher honor that you could get. And it's written on the left is the language. If anybody speaks Polish or can read Polish, it's all in Polish. The left is the language of the righteous Gentile, and the right is in Hebrew, and it's an acknowledgement that they did something very brave, that they saved Jews, and it also included, if you were alive, automatic citizenship to Israel. Some people used it, and if not, it was just posthumous. The most famous person, which I'm sure you've all heard of, is Oskar Schindler, and he was honored with this as well. But there's also lesser people, Frania, who saved 3 people, but I think there's over 20 people alive because of what she did. And I also would add, again, I forgot a few little facts, but I also would add that while, if somebody turned in a Jew, so like you could do 3 things, I would say, generally. You could turn in a Jew. During this period of time when Frania saved the family, you could turn in a Jew, and the reward for turning in a Jew, by the way, was the equivalent of what would cost a loaf of bread. So nobody got rich from turning in a Jew, that's for sure. So you could turn in a Jew, which is pretty much the worst thing you could do. You could do absolutely nothing, which is not great, but at least you didn't make it worse. But most people did far worse. Most people happily turned in, and some of them didn't even do it for the money. Some people just were happy to do it. They were just good with the program. What the goal, Hitler's goal was to make Europe free of Jews. So some people were very happy with that program, and when I think about it, it's astonishing to me that good people, good religious people, can sometimes be, do some pretty horrible things. So when I think about it, and my daughter said, well, what's your message for this? And my message is, when you see somebody struggling with something, whatever it is, do something. I don't expect everybody to risk their life, and I frankly, I don't think I would risk my life. That's it takes a certain person to risk their life. I don't expect that, but do something. There's something that you could do, and for sure, don't sell somebody for a loaf of bread. Don't take advantage of a situation where people are struggling, and so. I guess I would take some questions. I don't know how long I've talked, but that's basically my message. I also want to ask my friends, I have to also acknowledge that Voices of Hope is an organization that was started mostly by children of survivors. And our goal was to be there to speak when our parents are no longer alive or no longer able to speak. And Evelyn is one of my friends from Voices of Hope. She's also a child of survivors. And there's a lot of us in the community.
I want to say that my father was also saved by a farmer, a couple, and he was, they hid him and 4 other Jews. They didn't even know each other.
Yeah.
They were just traveling through, and sadly, my dad never went back to honor this person because, under communism, it was hard to travel. He was in Romania, and this took place in Poland, and so there were other people who risked their lives to save Jews, and they were never acknowledged for various reasons.
Yeah. Yeah, my mother used to say a person that survived the Holocaust had to be saved by at least 5 Jews. Like it just, it was because your odds were so slim. You couldn't really do that on your own. So, but thank you. Evelyn's going to speak in the future. Now that she's seen you don't have to be so good and you can still get up. You can still get up, right? It's okay. So.
Well, you were great, Sharon.
Oh, well,
I was wondering, could you tell us something about yourself?
Sure.
Who are you?
Who am I? I am.
We know who your mother is and your father.
It depends on what day, it depends on what hour of the day you ask me that question. I am a child of 2 survivors. My childhood, I wasn't so busy with this. I was, like I said, I was living my own life. My parents really, every household is different, not just for the survivors, but in every household is different. My parents didn't talk about it so much. They spoke Polish. All of their friends were survivors. I knew that. It was a fact, like there's air. But we didn't talk about it. The kids didn't. We didn't compare. We didn't talk about it. We were just living our lives. And as I got older, I got more introspective, especially when I had kids, and I started to think about, really, I started to think about my parents, what it would have been like when they were growing up, when they were raising us. When I thought about what they had gone through and how they raised me, a lot of stuff made sense. We were different than other kids growing. I mean, in many ways, the children of survivors were different, and in a lot of ways, and people have done psychological studies, they've written books, but I didn't know that I just knew my parents had accents. I didn't know that there was a whole way that we were being raised, that's the way that you get raised when your parents have experienced trauma, and that's basically it. In different ways, my parents were not in camps, so I didn't grow up in a household where people, like in some households, people were screaming every night, you can imagine, but I didn't grow up like that. I had a pretty charmed childhood in northern New Jersey, and now I'm married with my husband Paul, and I have 3 kids.
Do you live here in West Hartford?
I do. I live, on the other side, off of Farmington Avenue, almost at the city line. And so I moved here 33 years ago. And my mother, after my father passed away about, 12 years ago, shortly after that, my mother, not quite, he died in 2011, so more than 10 years ago. A few years later, my mother moved here, and she lived out her final 7 years in West Hartford, and she had a very nice life. I mean, in spite of everything, I would say my parents had a good life. My father's story is not as colorful, but in a way sadder, because he was the only person in his family. That's a whole other story, but he's the only one in his family that survived. And at least my mother had her sister, and they were close their whole lives, adult lives. But my father was really alone, and that's another sad story. But I don't know. I'm a lawyer. I work in Hartford. I mean, I don't know. It's, like I said, I could. I don't want to open up that question. I could go on for a
Why do you
long
think
time.
it's important to tell these stories now, in the early 21st century?
It's a great question, and I wrestle with that, because I think, again, you ask me in an hour, I give you a different answer, but I think my answer at this moment is, there's so many people. I don't want to make a big political statement, and I don't want to compare and contrast this event with anything going on in the world. In my view, it stands alone, and other horrible things also stand alone. I don't think anybody has to compare and contrast. I guess for me, there's so many people out there in the world that want to deny that this happened. And unlike most historical events, people actually are actively out there denying that this happened. And so I guess my feeling is that we're coming to, there's very few survivors alive. And, we're getting close to a point in time where people are going to be able to much more easily deny that it happened. There's a lot of, to their credit, I don't even understand how people could deny it, because to their credit, the Germans kept phenomenal records. There's plenty of photography, there's records, there's lists of names. We didn't keep the list. They have everything. The camps are there. A group of people from West Hartford recently went to the camp. People didn't erect these things, not Disney World, and yet there's people actively denying this. So for me, at this moment in time, I feel it's important to speak, to make sure that, everybody in this room, if you've now heard me, you're now a witness in a way. You now heard a child of survivors speak. We exist. We look like everybody, pretty much like everybody else. We're out there. We're in the community, and I think it's important for people to, by the way, just last week I found out, I don't know if anybody, there's survivors that you don't even know about, that bridal place that everybody talks about, Kleinfeld's in New York. I didn't know she was a Holocaust survivor. I just read that in her obituary. That's I don't know everybody that survived, but so there's people that walk among you that, maybe if they have an accent, you wonder where they're from, but otherwise, so I think it's important because people are actively denying that this happened. But for a church group, I think it's important to point out that, Christians are also part of the story. And in some of it, it's a very good story, and some of it is not. And everybody has to think about what that means. I don't believe in dwelling on what could have been. I believe in thinking about what that means and what I could do going forward. So that's why I think it's important to speak.
And can you tell us about what you brought us on the table?
Oh, yeah, this is a certificate.
No, we're here on everybody's table.
Yeah. You know what? In case, because I'm not a public speaker and I never know, but it's a nice crowd, so I was comfortable. I feel like I telling them in the car here. I feel like I was basically just telling a story and people can't interrupt me. That's all. I didn't feel. I people laughed a little too, so I felt okay about that. I was pretty comfortable. My mother's sister wrote a book, and my mother, contributed my mother wrote a lot of stories that were published in newspapers starting in the 80s. The first one that she wrote was about the Christmas Eve, and it was published it was either the New York Daily News or the Post. It was shockingly that. So then she got an appetite for writing, and so this is after I think at this point she had pretty much retired. She had a job in New York. So her sister wrote this book, and my mother included a lot of stories, so that's what it is, and it has some pictures, and on the cover is Frania walking with Pola and Lushik. As my mother's not in the picture because a lot of times she got left at home because she was the baby. But there's pictures. This was written at least 25 years ago. But I brought it just in case I needed a prop, but I didn't. I guess I didn't. What's he pointing? Oh yeah. Okay, good. Oh, two other things. One is thank you. On the table there's some Polish candies from Roly Poly. I just my mother always liked candies, and so I thought in her honor she would have liked there to be candies. And one of the stories that she wrote is called A Taste of Sweets, and it was about during the war when before they were in the ghetto, when she went to a friend's house and somebody gave her a piece of candy, and my mother really had a sweet tooth. She would, if somebody brought her a box of candies at night, she would just keep going and eating the candy. By the morning, no matter how big the box was, the candy was all gone. So she really liked sweets. And she went to someone's house and they gave her a piece of candy and she popped it in her mouth. And then she felt bad, and so she took it out of her mouth and she wrapped it back in the paper and she brought it home and gave it to her sister. There was nothing sweet. And so she said, and then at the end of the story, she said that was one of the biggest sacrifices of her life. And so I thought I brought the candies because in her honor. And the other thing I will very proudly mention, and I don't know if you had shared the article from the Current with the congregation.
We put it on our social media, but I haven't shared it with the congregation.
Oh, okay. Well, if you have a chance to read it, my mother passed away in November of 2021, but don't worry, she is watching this. She's watching this whole thing, for sure. And it just happened by coincidence. My son was going to DC for a weekend with his new wife, and a friend of a friend used to work at the White House. And it was the weekend of the Hanukkah party, and they got my son and his wife an invitation to the Hanukkah party at the White House. So it was a lot of fun. It was like, wow, and it got me thinking about, and he sent me pictures, and they're beautiful pictures, and it got me thinking about how that's what he was doing, and 80 years earlier, on Christmas Eve, pretty much the same time, my mother's being rescued from the ghetto, and I couldn't help but think about the irony of that, of how here's my son, having a great time at the White House. And 80 years ago, Jews were to say that they were unwelcome. The president at the time did not want to hear about the Jews. People came, it's already been documented, people came, they saw the camps, they went to speak to him. Non-Jews came to speak to him, and he had zero interest in doing a single thing for the Jews. And so they even were reducing the quotas for people that could come here. They made it even harder than it had been. And I think about, what can I say about the difference in time? And I would say my son was really in the right place at the right time. Through nothing that he did deserving, he's there. And my mother was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Equally, it makes no sense. Through nothing that she did, I was just introspective about the, comparing. And have we come a long way? Probably not, but in that situation, I was thinking about how odd it was in the span of 80 years, so, I don't know. Does anybody have any questions? I could just keep talking, I don't want to keep talking.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Oh, please.
Did your mother, you talked about not really being so engaged with her story when you were younger or interested. Do you remember, the turning point for her either when she began to share with you more? And did you ever, besides learning about this story, did you ever pick up on her, like retrospective emotions about it?
So, that's a great question. There was no turning point. I mean, it was always in the conversation. You know, there was never a moment where my mother sat me down and said, I'm gonna tell, I mean, I think in some families that happened. It was never a secret, but a lot of the conversation was in Polish, and I don't speak Polish. That was, you know, my parents specifically said they're not gonna teach us Polish, and then they spoke Polish all the time. But that was, you know, and I think my father did not want to hear Polish at all, and then that was, you know, what happened. But it was always in the air. Like, it would just come up randomly at a dinner table. A comment would come up there was not like a time when someone said, okay, now we're gonna talk about the Holocaust. I always knew that my parents were survivors. I always knew quite a bit, but again, it was just like your family child. I knew that I had only one grandparent, and he didn't speak any English. I knew that they had been killed. I mean, I knew a lot of things, but I didn't make them part of my life until I was older, until I had my own kids, and still I really started to think about what that, I didn't even really think so much about what it was like for my parents as young people. I started to think about it as a parent, like that, you know, wow, my parents had to raise us, and this was what they saw, you know, that interrupted childhood. And so and then I got, you know, as an adult, I got more in it. And also I was really busy raising my own kids. I mean, it's not, you know, but when my kids got a little bit older, and I got actively involved in commemorations. But even when I was involved here, it was more like once a year we have a commemoration. So we all come and do this, but it, you know, somehow, but that trip, I would say that the trip we took with my mother to her hometown, that kind of, that made it real. You know, if you've ever been to a place where you've heard about your whole life, like I thought, seeing my mother's town, you know, that made it like, if you could imagine going to where Hansel and Gretel happened. Like you've heard that story your whole life, and now you're in front of that witch's house, and you realize this is a physical place. That's what it was like to me, that to see these things, you know, tangibly and be there. So maybe that is a moment, but I was already involved before that. I mean, I wouldn't have gone if I wasn't involved. But yeah, no, I wish I had a good answer for you. I think some people do have a good answer. Some people know exactly when it happened, but I don't have that. Please.
Did Frania ever marry her?
Frania married when the Russians, for that year and a half, she married somebody, and then he was a soldier, and then he went to fight at some point, and then he was killed. So they weren't even married a year, really. And then she never had children. But she, like my mom, she would refer to these children, like, well, this is before these were her children. You know, she would walk around, she was very proud of these children. And, you know, absolutely was. Growing up, I heard more stories about Frania than I did about my mother's mother. I think Frania was much more involved in raising the kids. So, yeah, but she didn't have kids. So.
Very good. Thank you, Sharone.
Thank you. My brother years ago set up a website, and it has a lot of her stories, which are very nice. Her name was Irene Frisch, F-R-I-S-C-H, and if you just Google Irene Frisch, maybe you have to type in the word Holocaust, you will get to her. Her site is called Anne Frank and Me, and it's a bunch of, because they were both hidden, and it's a bunch of her stories, and it's got that little Nickelodeon clip, and that Nickelodeon boy is the same one that was in the White House. So it's just, you know, the other two did not do that.
So we'll put the link up on our Facebook page too.
Yeah.
So
it means a lot. It means a lot to me that people would know about my mother, but it also means a lot to me that people would know about Frania, because I think, see, she didn't have kids, and people need to know what she did. So, yeah. So, thank you. Oh, one more.
Would that be in the Holocaust Museum in Washington?
Would what be? I mean,
The story of.
I don't know. I mean, I think there's a place where you can search names. I don't know the answer to that question, but.